going to move on to a different text, which is the Pancharatra, a specific Pancharatra text called the Jayaka Samhita that Professor Gavin Flood is going to be talking about, and he's going to be looking at the deity. So Professor Flood is an emeritus professor of Hindu studies and comparative religion at the University of Oxford. He's a fellow of the British Academy, a senior research fellow at Campion Hall, one of the Oxford colleges, and academic director of the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. He's widely published. Some of his titles are extensively used in collegial courses, including his Introduction to Hinduism and the Ascetic Self. His interests lie in phenomenology, Hindu studies, comparative religion, and tantric texts and traditions. I don't really know of anyone who has who's looked at Indian religions that doesn't know Professor Flood at all. He's literally a gentleman and a scholar. So today, Gavin will be speaking on reflections on Pancharatra, conceptions of the deity. So over to you, Gavin.
Well, thank you, Alan, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to Gabriel and Ricardo also for inviting me to talk at this conference. And my apologies, I was so busy yesterday, I wasn't able to attend. But anyway, I'm here now. I'm going to share my screen and show you some slides. There's a handout that I've done, but I don't know how to get that to you, I'm afraid. So you'll have to just put up with the slideshow. Can you see that, everyone?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Well, I'm going to talk about Pancharatra concepts of deity. So it'll be more a kind of historical description this afternoon rather than a kind of philosophical analysis. But a lot of the issues and the analysis that Ricardo was raising with regard to the Bhagavad-Gita, I think can also be applied. They're also relevant to the Pancharatra, to the Jayaka Samhita that I'll be talking about today. So let's have a look at some historical background. So this idea that conceptions of God as a kind of creator, maintainer, and destroyer of the universe over and over again, that's quite early, it seems to me, and it certainly goes back to, well, certainly in the Gita, but also in the Jayaka Samhita as well. And the sources for the traditions that I'll be talking about in the early Middle Ages, early medieval period, from about the sort of 7th century to the 11th century, there was this sort of an emergence of these new texts that claimed to be a new revelation. They call themselves tantras or agamas or samhitas, and the Vaiṣṇava tradition got in on this as well, as it were. So there was an explosion of these new revelations from the Pancharatra within what was called the Pancharatra tradition. So today I'm going to be talking about the historical background, the sources, the concepts of God, theological implications, and conclusion. So the first millennium BC, we got the Brahmanical traditions of ritual, we got Varnashrama Dharma, we got renunciation, all of that had developed. And we got the smarta Brahmins, those Brahmins who adhered to the Smritis as their source of scriptural justification. And we get the rise of kingdoms like Magadha in the 4th century, the notion of sacral kingship, temple cities. So all this is established during that first period there. And between about 500 BC and 1000 AD, you've got sectarian worship of deities begins to develop. The dating of, I'm not very good with dates, but this is fairly imprecise, I think. And you get devotional worship, puja, replacing sacrifice and expressing devotion. So all this is in this early period. And bhakti to a personal god, a Bhagavan, or the goddess Bhagavati, becomes a central concept, central idea. So there's early worship of Vishnu, some hymns to Vishnu in the Rig Veda, and there's his 3 strides in the Rig Veda, very early text, separating the earth from the sky. He's a benevolent solar deity, often coupled with Indra, the warrior god. And the name is perhaps from Vish, to enter, the being who pervades the cosmos. I'm sure you know all this. But there's a deity called Vasudeva, who's Krishna, of course, Vasudeva. Now that term Vasudeva, the son of Vasudeva, is mentioned by Pāṇini in the Ashtadhyayi, where he explains the term Vasudevaka as referring to a devotee or a bhakta of Vasudeva. Now that's a very early reference, very early text. Between, I don't know the precise dates, I'm afraid, perhaps Angelica might know or someone might know, but it's between 400 and 100 BC, I think. Megasthenes, who was a Greek ambassador at the court of Chandragupta Maurya circa 320 BC at Pataliputra, records reverence to Hercules, who is interpreted as Vasudeva. And so we got those who worship Bhagavan, which is Vasudeva or Krishna, from this early period. And you get bhakti to the Lord, to this Bhagavan, the one who, the Bhagavat, the one who was possessing Bhaga, abundance, benevolence. And this religion was supported by the Guptas from the 4th to the 6th centuries. And the central text here is the Bhagavad-Gita. So in a way, I always think of the Bhagavad-Gita, although it's universal, it becomes universal. It starts as a kind of sectarian manual of the Bhagavatas who worship the Bhagavat. So in that early period. So you've got the Bhagavatas. Now Heliodorus, also a Greek ambassador, says in an inscription at Basnagar in Madhya Pradesh that he erected a column, sorry my spelling, I'm doing this in a hurry, with an image of Garuda in honor of Vasudeva, and that's 115 BC. And he calls himself a Bhagavata, and that's interesting. And even the Pali Canon mentions Vasudeva in a list of sects. So it's a very early, well, pre-Shaiva, but very early tradition. So I'm wondering how to get this to the next slide. Oh yeah, there's the Heliodorus column there. Now the Pancharatra is a different tradition from the Bhagavata tradition, although it's closely related. Its origins are back in the Shatapada Brahmana, where it means the 5-night. It could mean the 5-night sacrifice that's referred to there. But by the time we've got to the early Middle Ages, if you like, or the Gupta period, we've got 3 gems in particular, 3 texts are regarded as revelation: the Jayakya Samhita, the Paushkara, and the Satvata. And the Jayakya is a particularly interesting and important text in my view, and it contains one of the earliest representations of cosmology in this tradition, in the Tantric tradition generally. It's dated, it's prior to a Shaiva theologian called Utpaladeva, whose dates are 925 to 975. He quotes the text, so we know it's earlier than him. So it's pre-10th century. And it's the locus classicus of the identification of the body with the cosmos in Tantric literature. There's nowhere else in the Tantric oeuvre, if you like, do you get such an elaborate and interesting mapping of the body with the cosmos for a ritual purpose. So it's what I would call a pre-philosophical text in the sense that it contains, well, as the Bhagavad-Gita, I suppose, in the sense that it contains philosophical concepts and ideas, but they're not systematically worked out, which is the job of the later commentators. So particularly for the Vaishnava tradition, there's no commentary on the Pancharatra text. There's no commentary on the Jayaka Samhita or the other Samhitas. So in a sense, I suspect that Vedanta is Vaishnava theology. So in contrast to Shaivism, where you've got theological commentaries on the root texts, like the Malini Vijayottara, you don't have that with Tantric Vaishnavism. You just get the root text, the revealed text, and then the philosophy or the theology is in the Vedanta. So Ramanuja writes commentaries on the Brahma Sutra and so on, but and uses the Pancharatra Samhitas as a kind of a ritual basis. So it's a shame because they're very theologically rich, but they don't get a commentarial tradition. So this is just a kind of diagram that you've got. The Vaishnava Sampradayas. You've got these early sects, if you like, the Bhagavatas, the Pancharatra, and another tradition called the Vaikhanasa, quite close to the Pancharatra. These still exist today, the Vaikhanasas in South India, and the Bhagavatas morph into Puranic kind of traditions or broad mainstream Vaishnavism, where you get the four sampradayas and all the rest of it. But the Pancharatra is what I want to focus on. You've got a Krishna Gopala tradition also feeding into this, and Tamil sources. So I'm going to look at this tradition in the middle here, the Pancharatra. I just thought I'd show you some pictures, early representations of Vishnu. This is 10th or 11th century from the Punjab, pretty early, very standard classical image of Vishnu found in the Punjab. Vishnu, this is the 10th century chimera of lying on Shesha. His feet are being massaged by Lakshmi. So these are the two earliest representations of Vishnu that we have. The reclining on Shesha and the four-armed form. Now, early Vishnu becomes merged with other deities. It was a very complex history. There's a great book by Bhandakar called Shaivism, Vaishnavism, Shaivism, and Minor Religious Sects or something. But it's a really good, it's very old now, but I still think it's good, particularly on this early period of the amalgamation of these deities. You might disagree with that, but I still think it's a good text, that. And there are common themes in the early tradition. So the Lord is the Purushottama, the supreme personal with personal qualities, rather than being an abstract absolute. He's the cause of the cosmos, and God maintains and destroys it, and is revealed in images, I hesitate to use the word incarnation, but avatar, descent forms, and saints. I hesitate to use the word incarnation because there's no karane, there's no body involved. It's more of a docetic view, I think. So here's an early representation of Vasudeva, a widely worshipped deity adopted by royalty. This is about 190 to 180 BC from Bactria, the Greek kingdoms, of course. And here we've got Narayana. Now, Narayana becomes the central deity in many of these Pancharatra Samhitas, and this is from the Badami caves in Karnataka. I just thought I'd throw this in too. This is an early Vishnu, Krishna and Balarama from the Gilgit region. And there's a great book by Charlotte Schmidt, whose name I forget the name of the book now, but it's about the early Krishna tradition and the way Krishna was originally probably a dual deity worshipped with Balarama, so the twin dual deities of the two brothers. So this is evidence for that, I think. And another early image of Krishna from about the 11th century, holding up Govardhana mountain there. Now the Pancharatra was associated with the worship of Narayana, but in the Jayakya, he's associated with Vasudeva. And in particular, he has a doctrine of emanations. Now, the concepts of God in the Jayakya, I was going to look at 3 examples of the text itself, if we have time. You'll have to interrupt me, Alan, if I'm going on too long. So he's desireless, anicca, he's timeless, he's transcendent, he's the highest abode, he's self-knowing, and he manifests in various emanations. So these are qualities of Vasudeva that the text describes. And also omnipresent and omniscient. So he's everywhere and yet also beyond everything as well. And he manifests in particular as these emanations, these vyuhas. So this is a quote from the text. I'm going to give you 3 quotes from the text and then look at the theological implications. So this is from chapter 4. God is characterized by joy. He's bereft of everything that is to be avoided. Interesting. He's known to itself or known in himself. Having no point of comparison, he's the highest limit, the highest abode. So these are features describing God. The Lord is the refuge of all. He's bereft of action, so he's actionless. As in the wish-fulfilling jewel, everything is embodied and attached. Sorry, that doesn't make sense. The Lord is the refuge of all, bereft of all action, as in the wish-fulfilling jewel. Everything is as in a wish-fulfilling jewel, everything is embodied and attached, and everything is placed in order. So everything everywhere is known by the omniscient one. It's a bit convoluted, that sentence. He's without beginning and without end. That one is not being and not called non-being. So that's interesting, sort of apophatic language there. He's not being, but it's not called not being. So I'm going to discuss that in the Theological Implications. Everywhere his hands, speech, and feet, everywhere his eyes, head, and mouth. He stands everywhere, possessing scripture, know him to be encompassing everything. So a bit like the Bhagavad-Gita, really. He appears as having all senses and qualities, but yet is bereft of them. He has no senses or qualities, and yet has all of them. This paradoxical language in these early scriptures. That one is attached to being everywhere, without qualities, and yet enjoying qualities. He is established outside and inside of everything. So he's outside the universe, but inside it as well. He's actually our inner controller, our Antaryami. And know him to be moving and unmoving. He is not perceived on account of his subtlety. So we can't see the Lord because he's very subtle and misses perception, can't be grasped. Standing far away, the Lord who is supreme, who is the supreme self, abides in the heart. He's not distinct from all beings. He is perceived to be distinct, not distinct from all beings. He's perceived to be distinct from those beings. He is the support of all beings and objects. Although he is the destroyer, he creates. So I think that's a very interesting passage. Oh, a bit more. He's placed higher than ignorance. He is the illumination of all lights. He is knowledge and object of knowledge. He is achieved by meditation on him, visualization of him. He is bereft of all tastes and colors, yet possessing all tastes, all smells and tastes. The Lord is omniscient, the all-seeing one, the most eminent of all, the Lord of all. So, oh dear, it goes on. Sorry, I thought it was finished. Made of powers, autonomous, the supreme Lord is without beginning or end, bereft of all suffering. So know the highest absolute through supreme knowledge. When a man knows God, he is not born again in the cycle of rebirth. So I've got the Sanskrit. Now, this is on the handout that I've done, but I don't know how to get it to you. So we can perhaps go back to that in any discussion. Okay, so that's a very interesting passage, quite close to conceptions of God in the Gita, he's transcendent and immanent. He's in the hearts of all beings. He's desireless, and yet he's all desires as well, in some sense. He's the object of desires. Another passage from the same chapter where God is speaking in the first person. I am the creator, protector, and destroyer again and again through my gross form, the stula sharira, the gross body, the stula rupa, O Narada, through union with my own power, or by yoking with my own yoga, I dwell in the hearts of beings in a subtle form, and I give grace or make grace to devotees whose souls are developed or have been cultivated, bhavita, who are cultivated souls. Now, with the supreme form of joy, which is pure and pervading, I pervade all. O Brahmin, like sap in the tallest tree, watered at the root, having a top, branches, leaves, flowers, and fruit. Okay, so that's example 2. Quickly, example 3. I'm sorry, I've completely lost track of time. I should have timed myself. Okay. Stop me, so we got some time for discussion at some point. So the ultimate reality is non-distinct from Vasudeva and other manifestations, having 100-fold radiance of fire, sun, and moon. Vasudeva is the Lord, the truth of that absolute, the supreme Lord. It likes to repeat itself, this text, agitating his own agent. This is interesting, agitating his own radiance through his own energy. The Lord, whose form is light, manifests the god Achyuta, like lightning, O Brahmin. Then that Achyuta of firm radiance spreads his own form, dependent on Vasudeva, as a wisp of cloud depends on the summer heat. Very beautiful images in this. Then shaking himself, he in turn produced the god Satya, whose body is shining as the ocean produces a bubble. He is called the light made of consciousness, Chidmaya, who produces himself by means of himself as the god called Purusha, who is great, an unending stream of light. That supreme Lord is in turn the support of all the lower gods, their inner controller, as the sky is the support of the stars. as a fire with its fuel sends forth a mass of sparks, O twice born one, so the Supreme Lord, who is yet desireless, sends forth manifestation. Very nice image. So here we've got you've got transcendent Vasudeva, who's not on this diagram, and you've got the first Vyuha, the first emanation is Vasudeva. He generates Sankarshana, Pradyumna, and Aniruddha, but in our text, they're called Achyuta, Satya, and Purusha. So instead of Sankarshana, you've got Achyuta, and then you've got Satya and Purusha. And then that generates the mixed creation, and then that generates the impure creation. So he's the material cause of all of these, as well as the efficient cause or the transcendent cause. So the first four categories is called the Shuddha Sarga, the pure creation. I think they're getting this from the Shaivas. They have a pure creation, a mixed creation, and an impure creation as well. Now, the theological implications of this are interesting. Or, apart from the one passage where it says that God is beyond being and non-being, most of it is pretty sort of understands God as a being. So it's onto-theological, most of it. You do get elements of a kind of implicit critique of onto-theology, you know, that there's a God as a being alongside trees and rabbits and people and gods. Just another being like that, only the best one, the most supreme. But there's not much critique of that idea, implicit critique. You do get some passages like the one I read earlier, where it said he's beyond being and non-being. But on the whole, I think it's pretty onto-theological. And there's no view of God in this text as nameless, as anarchia, that we get in other tantric texts, like the Krama tradition. The big emphasis is on God as the goddess as nameless, as being beyond form, beyond predicates. So that kind of language tends to be absent from here. And there's no telos to creation, as there is in none of these texts, other than liberation of souls. So I think the Lakshmi Tantra, which is a Pancharatra text closely modeled on the Jayakya, I think in there it says what the purpose of creation is. It's liberation of souls. So God creates the universe and maintains it in order that souls can become liberated. But then you think you wouldn't have to do that if you hadn't created it in the first place. I'm sorry I've given you an inadequate. I want to go back to this. Now, mixed creation, there are two categories in mixed creation. This is the Samkhya categories. You've got Purusha, and instead of Prakriti, you've got Maya. Maya is the material substrate, if you like, from which the lower universe is manifested. And there you've got another Purusha, not the Purusha who's a Vyuha, but a Purusha who is the source of the bound souls. And they call this the Beehive of the souls. The Ali Kosha is a beehive. So you've got this kosha, this jiva kosha, in which all the jivas go back to at a destruction of the universe. And when the universe is reinvigorated once again, all the unliberated souls fly out like the bees fly out from a hive. And so they carry on doing that, reabsorption and flowing out again into the world until they're liberated. But this has no beginning and no end because the number of souls is infinite. So to place this idea in the history of Indian thinking, yeah, it has a good pedigree. And this text is probably influenced by the Bhagavad-Gita as well, which would have been in wide circulation by this period. So I think I'll wind up with concluding thoughts. There's little indigenous theological critique, I'm thinking, within this tradition. We've got Buddhism, we've got the Buddha, we've got the Jainism, we've got the Jina, we've got the non-dualists. They have a go at theological thinking, in which you have a distinct, they have a go at onto-theology, if you like. But there's not much indigenous critique of theology within the Pancharatra tradition. Well, there isn't any. And it does raise interesting theological questions. Do these conceptions have contemporary relevance? Do these ideas of God, do they speak to us today? Are they relevant now? Is the Jayakya conception of deity theologically coherent? I mean, or is it is paradox? Is it paradoxical, or can we say actually it's not thought through? It's incoherent. Or is there a contradiction between the transcendence, Vasudeva as pure transcendence, and Vasudeva as being in the world? Is that a contradiction? And what's the connection between them? Is it it's not a pantheism because God retains transcendence. So is it a kind of panentheism? Or what's the relation of the material world, if you like, to that transcendent power? So I think all those are open questions in the Jayaka Sankita. So I think I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Gavin. You set up the context for a lot of questions there. So I have a couple, but let me just see if anyone else has anything quickly. Who has anyone got any questions? Please stick up your hands or comments. Okay, we have Christopher up there. Oh, let's start with Christopher. Then
Thank you. Yes. Thank you for that. Just very quickly, this is the Charlotte Schmidt volume that you referred to. I certainly recommend.
Yes, excellent.
Be warned that it's a workout to carry around in your pocket. But I just wanted to ask about, and this connects with what Ricardo was saying. One thing that's constantly coming back in my mind as we discuss immanence and transcendence is Rigveda 1090, verse 3 in particular. And it's more of a sort of a fine information question, but where in the Vaishnava tradition do we actually get the first explicit engagement with Rigveda 1090, which gives such a clear model for this idea of, 1/4 of him is creatures, 3/4 are beyond. So much of that seems to be recurring in these texts that we're talking about, and I'm wondering where we get the first very explicit citations. I know tantric texts are not going to engage Vedic texts in the same way that, say, Ramanuja would, but so does anyone know where that verse comes into the theology?
No, that's interesting. It must be like an archetype. It must be some archetypal model, that, mustn't it? But I don't know when it gets cited. I should know, but I'm afraid I don't. Bhagavad-Gita might actually quote it even, I'm not sure, but it must be a text floating around in the background all the time. But I don't know of a direct citation or acknowledgement of it.
Well, in the Gita in the Bhagavad-Gita, you find quotations referring to this Purusha concept you are referring to, and I've dealt with it in my book.
Thank you.
In particular, in chapter 8, you have a lot of engagement with the Purusha concept of the Vedic Upanishadic texts. So sorry to have just thrown this in.
Very good, thank you. That's excellent. It's a very interesting idea, the notion of the Purusha. I mean, it gets translated as person, but its earliest usage is of this kind of cosmic being, as far as I can see. And I don't know when it's used as a person. It probably is. It might be my ignorance, but I don't know if anyone knows. Is the word Purusha used in an analogically? Is an analog to English person or European languages? I don't know.
Well, it's an analog to the male.
Yes,
it's the Sanskrit word of man, and and this is how it goes.
Yes, yes.
Well, if I may add, this was the topic of my dissertation at the OCHS. That Purusha and a person. That's basically.
No, I didn't know that, Itmar. That's very interesting.
Yeah, at the OCHS, yes.
Oh, good.
Yeah, that was big, yeah.
Okay, gonna have to ask everyone to put hands up before it starts getting out of hand here. So,
Sorry.
No problem. So now we can move over to Ricardo. Ricardo, he has a question.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you very much, Gavin. Thank you very much. Wonderful lecture. So I have one question about in one of your first slides you mentioned that list of properties or attributes. And one of them it's wrote timeless. So just to make sure that I really understood it, because later on when you quote one of the passages of the book, it is mentioned something like God doesn't have a beginning, it doesn't have an end either. So I ask this because usually in philosophy we understood eternity in two different ways. The first one is like everlastingness, that a person is eternal in the sense of he or she or it doesn't have a beginning, doesn't have an end. But there's a second sense, which you usually use the word timeless, in the sense that God is outside time. I'm not hoping that the text gives this kind of detail, of course, but I would like to hear from you if we have evidence for one or other options or a third option.
Yes, that's very interesting. I have wondered about that. I think there's a later text called the Ahirbuddhya Samhita, and that talks about two times. We've got a higher time and a lower time. And higher time, I'm not quite sure what it is, but lower time is what we, one damn thing after another. It's what we experience in life. And higher time is the cause of that lower time. I think Heidegger makes a distinction between temporality and time. So analogically, then that higher time is temporality, but it's not timeless. It's a kind of a more subtle time, more subtle power that gives rise to the sequential time. So I think that the Pancharatra text certainly seem to have a notion of time as sequential, and then but also as some more subtle quality gives rise to that. Now, God as is it eternal or is it timeless? And I don't think I've come across akala or anything like that, but I think it implies that God is outside of time. He's Vishvatirana, beyond the Vishva, beyond the universe. So that implies beyond time as well. So it's all figurative language, isn't it? It's difficult to make sense of, really. Yeah, so I suspect it's timeless rather than eternal, but somebody might disagree with me.
Thanks.
Does anyone disagree? I don't think so. I think you're on a roll. Okay, so moving over to Kenneth, do you have a question?
Thank you. Thank you, Gavin. I know you've been studying the Jayakya Samhita for a long time. And you mentioned at the beginning, if I understand right, that Jayakya Samhita is kind of a foundational text of the Pancharatra. And I'm just wondering, it's obviously a very strongly theistic Pancharatra, and I'm remembering Sanjukta Gupta saying that in Pancharatra one sees a progression, earlier Pancharatra being less theistic or non-theistic, and then the later you go, the more theistic it becomes. So would that indicate that the Jayakya is a later text, or how would you understand that?
That's a good point. Yes, I hadn't thought of that. I think it is a later text and it is theistic. And I suspect that the relationship of the Pancharatra that I've been talking about, the Tantric Vaishnavism, is what Pancharatra, I call it Tantric Vaishnavism, really. Now that is, there's an earlier Pancharatra tradition back in the first millennium BC. Now, probably the relationship between that Pancharatra, which is the one which is less theistic, probably along the lines that you were saying, Ken, and the later one is a bit like the relationship between early Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, something like that. The tradition gets transformed. So with the Tantric Vaishnavism, it's probably not much recognizable from the early tradition way back in the first millennium BC. So I think Sanjukta Gupta is probably correct in what she's saying there. Certainly the Jayakya is a theistic text, as we've seen in those passages. But it's particularly interesting because it describes ritual, but it's got a whole chapter on chapter 10 on the identification of the Bhuta Shuddhi, the purification of the body and the identification of the body with the structure of the cosmos. So it's very interesting, very early. And it's also one of the earliest elaborate visualization texts that we have, where it describes in great detail visualizations that you perform in this ritual process. So it's a very unique and interesting document.
Thank you.
I can't hear anyone. Is it me? I can hear you. I can see your lips moving, Alan, but I can't hear anything.
Your mic
I'm
is
so
off.
sorry. I muted myself. And I was asking Sutapa if she wants to say something quickly. Sorry about that.
Yeah, thank you, all of you. Nice to hear. There was a discussion regarding Purusha Tattva of the Lord, whether he's male or not. So how about this verse from Bhagavad-Gita 14.4, where he says that I am Aham Bij Pradapita, that I am the seed-giving father. So doesn't it establish well that he's a male form Purusha Tattva? So that was my question.
Yes, that's a good quote. I don't know, I'm afraid. Angelica could answer that probably better than me.
If I may?
Yes.
No, I was just referring to the ordinary sense of Purusha in Sanskrit as a male, as man. As in the grammar, you have this pungs Purusha in opposition to stri. So this would be the usual Sanskrit register. And because you have this usual Sanskrit register, of course, Purusha needs to be defined as a specific term for the self, conscious entity, and so on. But I would agree, yes, there is this clear idea of this use of the sexual relation. Also, it's the Prakriti is called yoni, of the god. So there is this male-female implication with Purusha and Prakriti going on as a kind of background thing. But on the other hand, you have passages in the Gita, and you have them also in the Narayaniya, where, of course, it's always Mata Pita, mother and father of the universe. So this would then transcend this kind of, gender issue.
Okay. I hope you're hearing that. Okay, I'm muting myself. So, Angelique, if you don't mind hanging on for a second, Fred's been waiting for a while. So please go ahead.
Am I unmuted? Yes. The talk about the Purusha Sukta in the Rig Veda reminded me of how infrequently we really do see any of these Vaishnava philosophers discussing anything from the Rig Veda. So it was really striking. This is a little bit off the main thing, but I came across a passage by Vittalanathaji, the son of Vallabhacharya, in his commentary just some years ago. It just struck me that where he did cite a Rig Vedic verse, and then he actually commented on it to some great length. It was in his commentary on the Siddhanta Muktavali, a short work by Vallabhacharya, and it's Rig Veda 156.3, which is a hymn to Vishnu by Dirghatamas, and it says, Tamu Srotara Purvyam Yatavada Ratasya Garbham Janushapi Partana Asya Jananto Namachid Vyuktana Mahas Te Vishnu Sumatim Bhajamahe. And this is used by him to simply illustrate the superiority of the path of bhakti, which translates here as, O singers, from your very birth you've satisfied him, the ancient source of cosmic order, Ratasya, to the best of your knowledge. You understand merely his name, have not spoken it out. May we, O Vishnu, the mighty one, share in your benevolence. Of course, this is repurposed for Vaishnava commentary, but it was so striking that you actually find somebody selecting something from the Rig Veda, one of these commentators. Just thought I would note that. Yeah.
It's very interesting. It's quite striking that you do get that reference then. Yes.
Yeah.
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 Amazing. Hi, Fred. Don't mind me saying so, but is that a bird on your shoulder? Or...
Yes, it is. He's been with
okay.
me for 36 years. His name is Papageno, and he can sing some Mozart opera.
Okay.
There you go.
Maybe we'll ask him to sing later. So
That's Sanskrit also.
So before I go, Angelica, you had your hand up, or did you take it down? Was that it was just a reference to before? Okay. So if there's no others, I have a question really quickly, if you don't mind. I'm unmuted. So there was a little reference there in the different excerpts you gave us, whereby the deity or even the divine, or whichever form, I guess Vishnu or whoever, is equated with joy, right? And there's a couple of places where joy pervade all, and there was another one whereby in a different where they among emanations and different things, joy was there, and the word used in between a copula is, you know, that connects the two, right? And we had this little discussion yesterday about this, about the type of this is, whether it's an is of identity, whether it's an is of predicate, whatever. But then later you said he's beyond predicates, right? So in your, I mean, I'm not asking you to, you know, answer this fully. I just wondering if you have a sense of where this is going and of why God would be related with joy in such a way, you know?
This is a good question. Why joy as opposed to any other of the qualities if he's beyond all of these things? But yes, he's Ananda Lakshanam. He's characterized by joy, by bliss. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's probably just as problematic as any other theistic tradition in which you have theistic language, and you've got that copula problem. God is love. You know, there's the Max Black thing that to understand a metaphor, you have to understand you apply the primary qualities the secondary qualities of the second part on the other side of the is to the first part. So he says, he quotes Max Black, man is wolf, you know, so you apply the qualities of wolf to the category man, person. Now, if you've got something like God is love, you apply the qualities love to God, but you've got to understand both sides of the equation. You can't, if you don't understand what God is, that he claims the metaphor doesn't work. So likewise with God is joy, well, I mean, I think I would dispute Max Black. I think it does tell us something about the nature of the being to which those predicates are applied. But if he's beyond predicates, God is. You can't have God is being. This is the Heidegger's critique of ontotheology. You can't have that. So God is extant. What does it mean? God is extant. God is being. So I think generally you do get, they seem to be aware of that, and you do get some theme of God is beyond predicates, is beyond opposites, but nevertheless they go on speaking about him in terms of joy and these positive characteristics.
Yeah, even this expression of that God is, in a sense, yeah, there's an essence of predicate, and there's also an essence of identity and everything. So you have this issue of like, in a sense, paradox that happens throughout these different texts, right? And could there also be a sense of understanding God as paradoxical? And the problem with understanding God as being is kind of almost ontologically paradoxical in a sense, or maybe it's a phenomenon, maybe it's the way we perceive it as well. The problem with that is that we end up with a problematic concept of God. We don't have a concept of God, right? In other words, we just can't, you know, we have the Advaitin thing, Anirvachanir, and we have the whole Chinta thing and all this stuff. So is there a sense in which the Pancharatras are trying to define a paradoxical concept of God? Or do you think actually it's just our lack of understanding the Pancharatras that gives us a sense of this God? Do you think it's a lack in the text or a lack in us? Or What do you think the...
Well, it's difficult. It's an interesting question, and I think it's a pre-philosophical text, and it's not all worked out. But they do seem to be aware. They want to speak positively of God. They're theists, you know. They've got a notion of a transcendent, putative theistic reality that is the goal and telos of the human life, and that creates and maintains and destroys the universe. So they want to keep that, and they have a sense that it's beyond language, I suppose. And they try to capture that paradoxical idea as being both the sustainer of life and being beyond life in the language that they use. Yeah, so why describe God in those terms? It's very interesting. Is it that you have, is it through they've been praying to God for 30 years or meditating on it, and then they come up with this kind of language because there's some objective reality which is a constraint upon the kind of language that they're using? That would be a theological, a theistic response to that question. That that there are objective constraints upon the kind of theological language that is being used. So it's not just random. It's not just that Ananda Lakshanam is a quality of Vasudeva. They would claim is because it is a quality of Vasudeva. Is constrained by the truth of Vasudeva.
Very interesting. Thank you. We have Ricardo.
Oh, I have a follow-up, but I think Itamar, if I'm not wrong, he raised his hand, his physical hand. Okay, yeah, so he has a question. Okay, I go for him, after him.
Oh, so thank you. I just saw, it was a short comment just to say that if we're mentioning Vaishnava sources and mentioning Madhvacharya on the Rig Veda, so in the Bhagavata Purana, the Purusha Sukta appears twice in the second book. That's what I want to say. Just, yeah.
So in my case, it's just a comment on what you have just asked, Alan. And Gavin, do you have information about how people at this time they saw the whole contradictory thing? Because we find a lot of contradictory or paradoxical statements in those texts. So I mean, generally speaking, how they dealt with the idea of contradiction, if they dealt it with at all.
Yeah, I think that the later mystics dealt with it in a sense of they were happy with the contradiction, that God is beyond predicates. But in the, I don't know the Vaishnava, I don't know how Ramanuja, for example, deals with it. I'm sure he must do. But the Shaiva tradition, you've got the Shaiva theists who comment on the equivalent of the Jayakya Samhita only in Shaivism, something, one of the Shaiva dualist texts, the Suprabhed Agama or something, and they're onto-theological. They don't have this notion of God beyond. They do a bit, but not much. They don't they don't seem to see that it's a problem. But then you get a non-dualist philosopher or theologian coming on like Abhinavagupta or his student Kshemaraja, and they do see the problem. They think, how can you speak of this reality in theistic terms? It doesn't make sense, because this reality is of pure consciousness, that they describe as pure consciousness as a positive attribute, is so beyond the qualities that we can attribute to it as to be completely beyond language. So I think that it depends on the sophistication of the philosopher, I suppose. So certainly I think in Shaivism, they seem to recognize the problem, and the non-dualists therefore rejected dualistic or theistic language. But the theist theologians don't seem to have a problem with ontotheology, except in short passages like the one I quoted where it says he's beyond being or non-being. Sorry, it's a bit dissatisfactory, the answer, but it's best I can do.
Okay, thank you very much.
Initial, so it's good. Angelica, you have your hand up.
No, I just wanted maybe to add something to that issue. When we talk about context of these earlier texts, I think this whole discussion, of course, takes place in the philosophical tradition. So you have all these issues discussed, debated, up and down within Nyaya, with Buddhist philosophers, with Sankhya philosophers, with Mimamsakas, Bhatrahari, early Advaita philosophers. There you find this discourse of dealing with contradictions, how you fight each other and try to, in a way, defeat the other by raising all these kind of incoherence issues. So there is, of course, in the Indian intellectual history, and of course, one needs to deal with these texts to address these discussions in the contemporary discourse. And I think texts like the Narayaniya, maybe also the early Pancharatra texts, they have a different purpose, I think, than proposing philosophically, because this happens elsewhere. And this is then only later implemented right into the heart of the Vaishnava traditions.
Yeah, excellent points. Yes, absolutely. Yes, you've got this strong intellectual tradition within India. And the texts like the Jayakya, they don't have commentaries on them. They're pre-philosophical, in my view. And that theology occurs elsewhere. It occurs in the Vedanta tradition, really. So the Vedanta, I always think as Vaishnava theology, and they leave the Samhitas for, well, they don't comment on them. So it doesn't directly inform theological debate. Although it's technically regarded as revealed, the word of God, it doesn't. I don't know why Ramanuja well enough. I don't think he cites Pancharatra scriptures, but he knew them. We know that, and he acted on them. His ritual tradition was Pancharatra.
One last question, if I may. I don't think anyone else has a hand up. These ideas, I mean, we're trying to really look at them from the point of view of trying to philosophically unpack them. I'm wondering, because Gavin, your expertise is in phenomenology. So I'm wondering, is there a potential for a phenomenological assessment of this particular idea of God or concept of God within the Pancharatras? And do you think that there's any way that it possibly could be true to the text itself in some way?
That's an interesting question. That would be interesting, a phenomenological analysis or philosophical analysis of this material. Well, partly these aren't philosophical texts. These are, as I repeated, they're pre-philosophical, but they nevertheless contain very rich theological concepts and about the nature of God and the purpose of life. So if phenomenology is letting be seen that which shows itself, at a first level, what shows itself is accessed in the text, is letting the text speak for themselves in a sense. And we do that through philology, in my view. So philology is a first level phenomenology that lets be seen what shows itself in the text. But we've also got to go further than that. Once we've done that, there are further tasks, and that is to look at philosophical coherence, to look at questions of truth, and to look at questions of what I would call constraint. What are the constraints that control the text into its particularity, that give rise to its utterances, not cause, but constraints? What are the controls that they're historical, but they could also be perhaps metaphysical constraints as well that control the utterances of text into their particularity. And I think there are. I think there are metaphysical constraints at work in a text like the Jayakya and other scriptures as well. But I think that's not, yeah, you'd have to defend that claim.
For sure. Okay. Thank you very much, Gavin.